Division of Ethics and Policy of the School of Population and Global Health. He's also an associate member of the IHSP, of the Department of Epidemiology and Biostats, the Max Bell School, you name it. His presentation today is called Weaponizing Uncertainty in Pandemic Times. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he'll speak for about 40 minutes. We'll have time for questions after. The way we work is, rather than sort of opening people's mics, please type questions into the chat box, and Jennifer Proudfoot from the IHSP will field the questions and, as necessary, perhaps combine them, and we'll have time for a little bit of back and forth with Nick. So Nick, thank you very much for agreeing to do this, and the virtual floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Daniel. I want to thank the IHSP for inviting me to give this talk. This is basically a work in progress. This is me attempting to collect a bunch of thoughts that I have, some in response to phenomena, events that have been ongoing during the COVID-19 pandemic, but also thoughts and ideas that have been percolating for much longer. And as I think you'll see, one of the things I'm trying to do is bring together longer-term trends in scientific knowledge and expertise with some of the short-term phenomena that we're seeing during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm really looking forward to questions and comments from all of you guys. I'm going to start with what I call snapshots of the politics of uncertainty. I'm going to give you 3 snapshots. The first concerns modeling and the backlash that has engendered during COVID-19. I'm sure you're all well aware of the kind of unprecedented importance that epidemiological models have taken since almost the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, certain models have been identified as the things that turned around some of the most intransigent world leaders in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. The first of those was a set of models basically engineered by Neil Ferguson at Imperial College that have been credited with convincing Boris Johnson and possibly Donald Trump, their administrations, to go from downplaying the COVID-19 pandemic to actually supporting some kinds of intervention measures, social distancing and otherwise. So we've seen an unprecedented explosion in the influence of models. What we have also seen is sort of an unprecedented explosion in backlash against and critique of those models. So very soon after these models were credited with influencing world leaders, a backlash has emerged. And a backlash has emerged to the extent that the modelers have taken to Twitter to defend themselves. And the backlash tended to take on a sort of thematic form, which was that as the models were updated, either to take account of changes in the world, so the implementation of social distancing measures, or tweaking the algorithms that are used to do the models, they were identified as being wrong or incorrect or mistaken. And the modelers, here's an example of Neil Ferguson, who convinced Boris Johnson of the UK coronavirus lockdown, saying, actually, it wasn't mistakes. Correcting the models doesn't mean that they were wrong, and it doesn't mean that the advice that we gave or the actions that were taken on the basis of those original models was flawed. This is sort of the normal process of updating models. Ferguson wasn't the only one. And here's an example of coverage in the Washington Post showing how this backlash actually happened. So after Ferguson gave new testimony to British officials about a week after the initial modeling, they hailed it as evidence that Ferguson and other experts were overselling the threat, and right-wing media in the US, Fox News host Laura Ingraham, wrongly stated that in his testimony Ferguson's projections had been corrected. A Wall Street Journal columnist wrote that the revision raises serious questions about the radical countermeasures inspired by public health experts like Mr. Ferguson. Ferguson wasn't the only one. The University of Washington-based and Gates Foundation-funded Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation models, which have been widely publicized and have apparently influenced the Trump administration as well, have also faced a backlash of their own, being critiqued, I think quite rightly, for some flawed assumptions in the models. And, you know, people like Mark Lipsitch at Harvard University, that's not me, that's someone else who's got some,
Nick, your mic is off now. If everybody but Nick, everybody except for Nick could turn off their mics, that'd be great.
So can you hear me now? Okay, great. So Mark Lipsitch at Harvard University said the HME models were not something that most of us in the infectious disease epidemiology think is well suited. Interestingly, Lipsitch himself, after promulgating some of his own models, came under criticism and attack from Deborah Birx, Trump's advisor on COVID-19, and he also took to Twitter to defend his models. So that's snapshot number one, models making projections, being updated, and then being taken to task where their updates are seen as corrections that then become a vehicle to criticize whatever policy responses were taken based on the model's advice. My second snapshot concerns the work of John Ioannidis, who I think is familiar to many of the people who are on this call. So John Ioannidis is sort of a legendary figure in meta-science, the study of how science is produced, who very early in the pandemic published an article in Stat News entitled "A Fiasco in the Making," where he basically said, we don't have enough evidence to be able to defend or support or legitimize the extensive lockdown measures that are being taken, and we need to actually wait for more data to come in. And he was taken to task very quickly by Mark Lipsitch, who said, actually, we do know enough to act decisively against COVID-19. But this isn't actually where the Ioannidis saga ends. Ioannidis has, over the course of the past couple of months, essentially doubled down on the argument that not only models, but all the data that we have for COVID-19 is not enough to justify specific kinds of lockdown measures and interventions. So just, I think about a week ago on the 11th of June, he published a preprint at the International Institute of Forecasters, which I'm not really sure what that is, where he again said, after a couple months of criticism, until we accrue more information, immediate better safe than sorry responses are legitimate, trust extreme forecasts are possible scenarios, right? An additional thing that John Ioannidis has done is in April, he and some colleagues published a very, very widely publicized study of antibody seroprevalence in Santa Clara County, California, where essentially in this study, which was posted on the medRxiv, which is a preprint server, he and his co-authors said that the population prevalence of COVID-19 antibodies implies that the infection is much more widespread than indicated by the number of confirmed cases, and therefore the lockdown measures that have been taken are unwarranted, that we don't have to worry so much about it. Now, one of the interesting things about this medRxiv preprint is that it achieved incredible circulation in social media and media coverage very, very quickly. So this is from a great study that the New York Times published about that study, saying almost immediately it was seized upon by a group of...
I'm on a call. I can't have a discussion.
We need everyone to mute their mics. Thank you. So it was immediately seized upon by two distinct sets of tweeters. One was a sort of right-wing media operation that identified it and retweeted it, and very quickly, by noon on the day that it was posted, it had achieved tens of thousands of retweets, all basically saying, this model shows that government action is overblown. But on a much slower time scale, it was also retweeted among the scientific community, who actually, instead of just sort of retweeting it en masse, said, actually, we need to look very closely into their assumptions, and essentially critiqued it, and I think quite correctly, basically said that this is disastrously flawed, both in its methods and in its conclusions. Interestingly, two things developed very quickly afterwards. First, Unitas made the rounds of conservative media, not just Unitas, but also his co-authors. He appeared on the Laura Ingraham show. His co-authors appeared on Tucker Carlson's show. So they essentially went on a media tour, both before and after the preprint, essentially saying, our study demonstrates that the government response is overblown. It also came out very quickly. The enterprising journalists at BuzzFeed, who had been covering Unitas for a number of years for his meta-science activities, noted that the study appeared to have been funded at least in part by the founder of JetBlue, who had earlier published an op-ed essentially agreeing with the conclusions, saying government response, US government response to COVID-19 is overblown. We shouldn't be going into these lockdowns because it damages the economy, and in particular, airlines. As you can see, this is from a blog post that he put on the Daily Wire on April 7th, a week before the medRxiv preprint, where he said, my search for a solution has led me to three amazing and dedicated professors at Stanford. I've come to know them personally, Unitas, Jay Bhattacharya, and Aaron Ben-David. Using their epidemiology models and other evidence, have questioned from the beginning the true number of those who have been infected. So again, this is a very powerful funder of research going on record a week in advance of the publication of the preprint to essentially say there is contradictory evidence that seems to disprove US response. I think most of you are familiar with these two snapshots. My third snapshot is a little funky. So on the 30th of May, The Guardian published an article, or published a letter talking about Dominic Cummings, who was a close confidant and advisor to UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, condemning him for essentially breaking his own government's rules on lockdown, taking a cross-country trip with his family and stopping a number of times. This letter was authored by a number of professors in epidemiology, global health, and bioethics in The Guardian, but I was actually drawn to the letter immediately below it, which was from David Hockney, the celebrated modernist artist, entitled Don't Blame Tobacco, where Hockney complained about an earlier op-ed that had criticized him for his rigorous defense of smoking. I thought this was really interesting, and I followed that link to that op-ed, and I found that it was an op-ed that talked about how Hockney has, for a long time, very vigorously defended smoking, attacked anti-tobacco activists, and seized upon a very particular study that appeared to suggest that smoking is protective for COVID-19. Now, this study you may be familiar with. It was another preprint that was produced by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It was a piece of descriptive observational epidemiology that in one table seemed to show a very small protective effect for smoking. As epidemiology Twitter very quickly seized upon, the interpretation of this descriptive article as causal was actually quite flawed, that the authors might have been guilty of something called collider bias, and that readers were committing something called the table 2 fallacy, where they were misreading a correlation as evidence of some kind of causation, and that Hockney, among others, was taking this misreading and weaponizing it in certain ways. So what's going on here? What do these snapshots illustrate? Well, in the remainder of this talk, I want to give my ideas about what's going on here. And I first want to say, I think there are a number of explanations floating around that I think are wrong, or at least incomplete. So one common explanation that has been mounted by Anthony Fauci, among others, and I have unbelievably enormous respect for Anthony Fauci. This is one of the very few times where I will disagree with him. A lot of people say, well, this is just anti-science, and this is people who don't like science or don't like scientific expertise. I think there are certainly a lot of people who are profoundly anti-science, but I don't think that that explains everything. And in fact, I think that then distracts us from what's really going on. There's another critique, which is that this is just the promulgation of bad science and it's drowning out good science. And what we need is more good science. Again, I'm not going to say that there isn't a lot of bad science out there. I think some of the examples I've given are evidence of really shoddily done science. But again, I don't think that completely explains it. There's a lot of saying that people just aren't listening to experts, or they aren't listening to the right experts. This is what in philosophy we call epistemic trespassing, where we put too much weight on the wrong kinds of experts. There's a lot of saying, well, whatever it is being politicized. The evidence about mask wearing, the evidence about social distancing, the models or something are being politicized. Finally, and in the scientific community and in the public health community, I've seen a lot of hand-wringing saying, well, what we really need is more data. The problem here is that we just don't have enough data, and if we had more data, a lot of these problems will go away. Again, I think there is some element of truth that these all play a role, but I don't think that these fully explain what's going on, and I actually think that if these are the explanations we settle upon, whatever mitigation measures we take now or into the future will actually be futile or potentially even counterproductive. What I think what is going on is that these snapshots illustrate the weaponization of uncertainty and disputes over the proper place of scientific evidence and expertise in policymaking and public life. And I think these disputes have both pre-existed the COVID-19 epidemic and they will continue on afterwards. And that the COVID-19 epidemic basically foregrounds trends that have been going on for a long time. And the way I assess what's going on is I think there are particular actors who use weaponization tactics, a trend that is accelerated and amplified by the current context. And I want to talk about each of these in turn, the actors, the tactics they use, and how this is amplified and accelerated by the context that we're in right now. I talk about actors because I think there's something very, very important. A lot of the sort of wrong or incomplete descriptions or explanations I gave earlier like to focus on particular actors and say, well, there are people out there who are just anti-science, or there are people out there who are just doing bad science, or the wrong experts are getting too much media coverage. Again, I'll stipulate that there are, but this does not explain everything, and it certainly doesn't explain the importance of weaponization. Anyone can weaponize. Weaponization is opportunistic. Let's take one of the most obvious weaponizers of uncertainty, which is Donald Trump. In many ways, when it suits him, Donald Trump will mount anti-science rhetoric. But when it suits him, he will be very, very much pro-science. You can bet that when a vaccine is developed, he will take full credit for it, just as my colleague Jake Hoffman has pointed out, he's taken credit for a non-existent HIV/AIDS vaccine. Weaponization is a tactic that is used opportunistically by a variety of actors, sometimes including scientists themselves. Weaponization is tactical. It serves some other end. And that's the thing we have to always think about. Not look just at the weaponization itself, but look towards the ends that it's being put toward. It's often deployed as a form of motivated skepticism. Now, that skepticism is often, but not always, of scientific authority. We can see weaponization of uncertainty against all sorts of different authority. And this is, again, why I think the science, anti-science, good versus bad science explanation is incomplete. It's not just about a science. It's about motivated skepticism of expertise of different sorts. In particular, it's used to undercut claims to expertise, of the authority of individual experts, of entire fields of expertise, or the role of experts in policy generally. Again, it's not just about science, it's about expertise, and in particular, it's part and parcel of a populist rhetoric that equates expertise with elitism. Now let's talk very specifically about the tactics that are used in weaponization. The first is what I've already alluded to, which is motivated skepticism. And motivated skepticism has a long and inglorious history. It has been, as has been chronicled by the science historian Naomi Oreskes and others, been most effectively mobilized by powerful industries to sow seeds of doubt around essentially settled scientific consensuses or consensi, whatever, about climate change, about the impact of tobacco smoking. This tactic requires impossible levels of certainty and casts doubts on opponents when they cannot provide it. So it basically says, in order to accept the recommendations that particular experts make, they have to be 100% certain. And if I can poke a 0.1% hole in their argument, the entire argument collapses. As a British American tobacco executive in 1969 said, doubt is our product since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy. This is why I love that Cummings and Hockney juxtaposition, because what we see in the current weaponization of uncertainty is part and parcel of this much larger trend that wasn't started by tobacco executives, but maybe was perfected by tobacco executives starting in the 1940s and 1950s. We can see it with the backlash against modelers. Modelers, even the responsible ones who publish good confidence intervals, who say, I'm not giving you a point estimate, I'm giving you an upper lower bound of what might happen, and I'm tweaking it. The second they tweak it, they are taken to task, and seeds of doubt are sown. This is straight out of the tobacco industry and climate science deniers' playbook. This is also, I'm chagrined to say, what John Ioannidis is now trafficking in, saying if models are not perfect, then the entire argumentative superstructure that's built upon those models completely falls apart. Another example of this is early in the epidemic, Richard Epstein, a legal scholar, published something in the Hoover Institution's website where he similarly took to task epidemic forecasting models and gave his own forecast where he said, you know what, these are really overblown. I think that given that there's only been 67 deaths, there's going to be only about 5,000. Tactic number 2 is what I call selective amplification. And this is when powerful interests use their financial, economic, political power, or their access to the bully power pulpit to selectively amplify particular arguments to give them a disproportionate place in the public debates around, in this case, how we should respond to COVID-19. Amplify the doubters and then discredit critiques of possible conflicts of interest. Again, this has a long history before COVID-19. The sugar industry did this with respect to dietary fat and its role in cardiovascular disease. And I'd say this is an example of what the JetBlue founder was actually doing. He was identifying people whose arguments or whose evidence or position would support his own position and helping to amplify what they had to say. Not because what they had to say was a persuasive argument, but simply because it supported his preconceived ideological goals. Part and parcel of this is when people are called out for this selective amplification, for having a conflict of interest, it's to push back strongly on the idea that a conflict of interest might be important. So when BuzzFeed interviewed the authors of that Santa Clara study, they said, you know, David Neilman, the JetBlue founder, has a particular perspective and some ideas and some thoughts. I don't know exactly who were the people who funded the study eventually, but whoever they were, none of them really told us it should be designed in a way, given a way, or done in a given way, or find a particular type of result, or report a particular type of result. What Ioannidis is saying here is, look, they didn't tell me what to say, so it's all fine. It's not a conflict of interest, but the point here is not the conflict of interest, it's the selective amplification. Let's go right by that. A third tactic is, and I think this will be clear to everyone, that this plays well with the politics of authoritarianism, most obviously illustrated by Donald Trump. And part of this tactic is to claim certainty and to celebrate intuition and authority over facts and expertise. Let's remember that literally one of the first actions that Donald Trump took as president of the United States was to make a blatantly false factual claim, and instead of retreating, to continuously double down on that factual claim. In this case, the claim that his inauguration was the biggest ever. Even after definitive photographic and other proof came out that, in fact, it was dwarfed by Obama's previous inauguration, he and his minions kept doubling down. Sean Spicer, the press secretary, said this was the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration, period. Very famously, the next day, Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway went on, I think it was Meet the Press, and said, well, you guys are saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving alternative facts. It's this doubling down on the idea that it is authority, it is in authority figures that facticity resides, not in elite experts. This was the first salvo in an exercise of power. And here I just point to the amazing essay by my colleague Jacob Levy in November of 2016, which points to how important this particular move is in setting the tone for the public debate around authority and its relationship to truth and expertise. Because making people repeat lies isn't necessarily just about enshrining those lies as the truth. It's, as Levy states, being made to repeat an obvious lie makes it clear that you're powerless. It also makes you complicit. You're morally compromised. Your ability to stand on your own moral 2 feet and resist or denounce is lost. This is a power move regarding people in the Trump administration, including the experts, the hopeful adults in the room who work for the administration. And what happens after this is the experts who are then denounced, who don't toe the line, are taken to task in the public sphere, as we see Anthony Fauci, and also, just because I don't want to make this too US-centric, we're seeing this emerge now in Brazil under the leadership of Bolsonaro. The second part of this tactic is to model defiance of expertise. So celebrate one's own authoritative proclamations while modeling defiance of one's own experts. I would submit that Dominic Cummings' cross-country trip wasn't just, sort of off the cuff ignoring experts. I think this was demonstrating to the populace that the people in power don't even believe the experts, don't believe the idea of independent, impartial experts within their own administrations. And clearly Donald Trump has continued to model this in many ways, including rejecting the idea of wearing masks. Finally, a third part of this is to practice a politics of uncertainty that deflects criticism and accountability. When I first started putting this talk together, I, of course, Googled weaponizing uncertainty. And really the only thing I found was this paper on weaponizing uncertainty in trade policy. And it makes a very interesting point, which is what the Trump administration has done is they have continually changed their approach in trade policy. One day they'll do something, the next day they'll do another, the next day they'll do another. It echoes it's almost predictive of what's been happening with their COVID-19 policy, among others. And what this does is, even as you are taking to task your opponents for being uncertain, you practice an actual policy where you're constantly changing what you're doing, and you never have to be accountable for any one particular thing. You proclaim certainty, but you practice uncertainty. Tactic number 4 is, I think, well known, and this is actually explicit use and promulgation of misinformation and disinformation by obfuscating, prevaricating, manipulating, and suppressing evidence that might actually give us some additional certainty around things that we might disagree with. Again, in the United States, we definitely see this. There's some evidence that a number of states that have reopened are actually manipulating data to support the reopening. Disinformation has been a cornerstone of the Trump administration, but it's not just Trump and it's not just in the United States. Again, we have seen the promulgation of misinformation and disinformation as a tactic for promoting uncertainty and weaponizing uncertainty for a number of years, if not decades now. A very important note here is that we often think that correcting misinformation or disinformation will make the problem go away, that sunshine will disinfect and cleanse. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. Sunshine doesn't disinfect if the ultimate goal is greater distrust of expertise, particular government expertise. You're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because if you correct misinformation or disinformation, it actually supports the greater idea that there's some kind of grand conspiracy at work. And we can see that even in Canada, We have some worries about there being a conspiracy. We already have conspiracies about COVID-19 vaccine. So transparency and correction doesn't necessarily make the problem of misinformation and disinformation go away. The final tactic I'll talk about is flooding the zone. And this is the idea that has been most, taken to the extreme by Russian disinformation campaigns of disorienting audiences with an avalanche of competing stories. Misinformation or disinformation obviously is producing obvious untruths with the idea of supporting one or another pre-existing ideological goal. Flooding the zone may not necessarily have a pre-existing ideological goal. Again, it's not science or anti-science. It's flooding the zone with so much competing information that it leaves people awash and at sea and unable to comprehend exactly who to trust anymore. So the Russian campaign to influence American elections, many people think about, well, they pick the candidate that they want to win. That may or may not be true, but the greater problem is that they try to sow so much chaos in the information ecosystem that it becomes more and more difficult for us to gauge where truth and expertise resides. Flood the zone, actually, I was introduced to it by an amazing book called This Is Not Propaganda by Peter Pomerantsev. I highly recommend everyone read it. And also it was credited to Steve Bannon, the former advisor of President Trump, who basically said, again, we are not actually trying to convince anyone of anything. We are just trying to overwhelm people with information. All right, let's turn now to context. I mentioned before that particular actors use weaponization tactics, a trend that is accelerated and amplified by the current context. What do I mean by that? Well, first, I don't have time to say how all of the tactics have been amplified, so I'm just going to look at one or two. I'd say that, ironically, we, and by we I mean people in academia and academic science, have been flooding the zone for years. We've been flooding the zone with information, including information about health. So this is the annual citations added to Medline. Here are a couple citations from, you guessed it, John Ioannidis, where he published a study in 2018 talking about hyper-prolific authors who publish dozens and dozens, sometimes hundreds of articles a year, all saying some versions of the same thing. I like to point out that this was published when he had already published 78 articles in the year that it was published. Many of the methods that we in science use to help aggregate and filter this information, which may have worked in the past, are now even contributing to flooding the zone. I'll just identify things like systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which are supposed to do the work of dealing with this flooding of the zone, are now actually contributing to flooding the zone. It's just faster and more visible now. This has been going on for years, but it's been behind the scenes. What we see now, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, is that this is made much more visible. So it's not that it's COVID-19 exceptionalism, it's accelerated and amplified by the particular circumstances we have now, where we have not just researchers here talking on an extended way about the products of scientific knowledge making, we also have this happening in real time in the public sphere and among people who, frankly, their Twitter followings are much bigger than these people. And COVID-19 also lends an unusual air of urgency. It matters. Most of these, it doesn't really matter if we take action within the next day or week. But what COVID-19 does is it says, with this huge flooding of the zone of information, we need to take action on the back of each of these pieces of information. So I'm going to conclude by saying, how do we counteract the weaponization of uncertainty? I'll be frank, I don't really know, so I'm just going to throw out some ideas, and I'm really interested in hearing some of your responses to some of these ideas. I have one big idea and a number of small ones. The first is, I think we need to engage in an effort to counteract the demand for certainty in a lot of different arenas of public life. Oh, I just did something that I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. So who wants certainty? Well, I'd say all of us do. There are a lot of powerful things in the information ecosystem that push us in the direction of demanding certainty. Among individuals, well, uncertainty sucks. It's very difficult to make decisions about one's own personal ideas, about one's personal behavior, about the behavior of your families, when there's tremendous uncertainty. I think we're all living through that now. We understand, we really want, I can say in my own life, I really wish I knew definitively about what I should be doing with myself and my family just in day-to-day activities. Uncertainty is complicated, and the fields of behavioral economics and cognitive science have been demonstrating for decades that humans don't reason well under conditions of uncertainty. There are also powerful trends within the information ecosystem to favor certainty over uncertainty. I'm a big sports fan, and if you look at sports media, it's dominated by hot takes. That is interviews with people who will say, oh, I think the Ravens are going to win the Super Bowl, or the Canadians are going to win 30 games. And they're never held accountable for these predictions. And part of the ecosystem really likes the idea of hot takes that are expressed with absolute certainty. Why? Well, again, a lot of literature on the information ecosystem says certainty activates very powerful positive and negative affective responses in a way that uncertainty doesn't. Finally, I'd say that decision makers, and I'd say everyone from individual clinicians all the way up to world leaders, really are desperate for certainty in some cases. And this is what the political scientist Charles Mansky has been talking about for years. Certainty seems to protect them against under or overreaction. In past epidemics, whether it was swine flu or the H5N1 epidemic, there has been a backlash against the presumed overreaction. And what world leaders often want is they don't want uncertainty. They don't want confidence intervals, upper and lower bounds. They want a point estimate that they can then point to as supporting a particular decision. In addition, certainty seems to assist in projecting control and competence. Uncertainty is perceived of as weak and wishy-washy and flip-floppy. So here's some specific ideas about how to fight weaponization. I said this was a small idea. It's actually, and I recognize it, a huge, huge ask, which is to reform the overall information economy, to encourage robust debate and say that debate over facts, scientific facts, is a feature, not a bug. This is business as usual in how we produce scientific information. Revision, correction is not an indication always of flaws. It is an indication that actually science is working, and that robust debate and revision should not be seen as gotchas, but should actually increase our trust and faith in this particular mode of knowledge production. I think we need to report and normalize uncertainty, again, as a feature, not a bug. The final thing I will say is a lot of people are pointing to what they think of as the negative impact of preprints and the lack of filters on information. You may note that almost every piece of scientific information that I have cited sprang from a preprint, that is non-peer reviewed. I have to confess, I'm not exactly sure what to do about this, except to observe that I don't think the problem is preprints versus published literature, because as we know, as Yanitas and others have shown, a lot of the problems that we see with preprints also impact the published literature, and scientific journals are not necessarily the best filters. A second thing that I would suggest is that I think we need to break the cycle of selective amplification and winner-take-all science. There's a reason we keep seeing the same names pop up over and over and over, and that's because in the scientific field, there has been a long cycle of identifying and anointing winners, supporting them with resources, and giving them a bully pulpit that is disproportionate to the actual strength of their arguments. The IHME has been supported by hundreds of millions of dollars from the Gates Foundation. Yanitas has been supported by millions of dollars from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation and then JetBlue. We can also see with some other recent controversies how we see that powerful pharmaceutical companies often are practicing science by public relations or science by press release. I think this is part of a larger cycle where selective amplification is playing an outsized role. Third, and most important, I would say, I think we need to change the role of science in policymaking, where we need to focus not on the idea that scientific experts are there to provide certainty, but scientific experts are exemplars of the values that we should espouse in democratic politics. I'm worried that we are going to see a backlash during or after COVID-19 where we replace authoritarianism with technocracy, blind faith in the idea that science provides certainty. I think instead we should institute procedures rather than anointing experts. Here I actually go along with a sort of strand in the history and sociology of science. Naomi Oreskes, I think, made a very powerful point where she said, in suppressing their values and insisting on the value neutrality of science, scientists have gone down a wrong road. They've made the mistake of thinking that people would trust them if they believed that science was value-free and thus a font of certainty. I instead agree with Harry Collins and Robert Evans in their book, Why Democracies Need Science, who say, if you think our existing societies are benign, then it may be wise to make science and technology answer to them. But if you think our societies are becoming more corrupt and less benign, then you might want science and technology to retain their independence. We're looking at science as an institution that can give moral leadership. Democracies need science because science is or can be a fountainhead of good values. And I'm at 40 minutes, going to wrap up in about 2 minutes. What are those values? Well, there are a lot of them. I'd say some of the most important go all the way back to Robert Merton, the ideas of universalism, disinterestedness, organized skepticism, but also honesty and integrity, transparency about uncertainty, continuous revision, and humility. These are the values and norms that are practiced by what I would call good science and also are very common to well-functioning democracies and democratic ideals. My final suggestion is, in general, that we all have a duty to encourage tolerance of uncertainty and judicious skepticism of incredible certitude, an idea I take from Charles Mansky. I see a lot of people, I'm often surprised, in the midst of COVID-19, almost promoting a blind faith in experts and others who claim certainty, so long as that certainty parallels their own preconceived ideological ideas. I don't think we should do this. I think this is our discomfort with uncertainty talking. Instead, I think this is a moment for us to really enshrine, not just in democratic politics, but across multiple parts of the public arena, the idea of educating consumers about motivated skepticism and incredible certitude. There's a movement within clinical medicine already to try to do so. Charles Mansky has also been advocating for this in the public policy arena. I'll give a shout out here to myself. I've been teaching about this among medical students at McGill for upwards of a decade, along with my colleagues, Jay Brophy, Hoffman, and Sam Harper, and institutional design which might now need refreshing or reforming. He said that in 2018. I think it is very profound and it is absolutely essential in 2020 and going forward. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. And I'm looking forward to questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm not going to take any time. I see that we already have some questions in the comment section. I think Jennifer has been going through them. So Jennifer, can you
Yes,
address some questions?
Yep. Sorry, my dog just had a little bit of a barking fit, so my apologies. Yeah, no, so we have some great questions that have come in, and they're not from too many people. So I'd actually suggest, we've had a few from Salim Razak, and I was wondering if we could, to be a little bit discussion style, maybe Salim, you could show your video and just ask a question, because you've had a few there. Maybe you could choose one and directly intervene. There we go. Yeah.
Hi, Salim. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Hi, Nick. How are you? Thank you for this really interesting talk. I'm so glad that, well, in a way, I'm so glad that COVID happened in a way to bring this all to Zoom, that we can actually attend. But I guess my question, I'll ask my last question, which was really that you got me thinking a lot about the old Greek rules of rhetoric, ethos, logos, and pathos, you know, and the idea of kind of the arguments being mismatched. So like, I'll give you an example. So when we appeal to authoritarianism, it seems to be about pathos, and then the scientists are kind of responding about logos. And then there's ethos, which seems to be about anti-elitism. And it's really the mismatch idea that really got me thinking. And I'm wondering, you know, if in the points that you said to address the issues of uncertainty, if you can sort of think in terms of ethos, logos, and pathos.
Well, you're really putting me on the spot here, because despite being half Greek, I can't say that I'm an expert in ethos, logos, and pathos, and pathos. But to pick up the spirit of your point, I do think there is something of a rhetorical mismatch. And I think that one of the difficulties we see here, and again, it's accelerated by this sort of 24/7 news cycle, by the need to always be constantly responding, we fall back on convenient rhetorics, right? A convenient rhetoric of authoritarianism is the authoritative leader is correct, right? Truth resides in power. A convenient rhetoric, I think, of a naive view of science is truth resides in the scientific expert. And I think, yeah, I guess one of the things that I'm saying is, instead of always falling back on these convenient rhetorical devices that again they are amplified by the current information ecosystem. You know, those tweets from Lipsitch and Ferguson and others, and I'm not saying that Ferguson or Lipsitch are perfect in any way. You know, they're having to tweet about incredibly sophisticated epidemiologic models. And I think they do try to say there's a lot of uncertainty and revision, but honestly, I do think that providing a different kind of set of rhetorical tools is absolutely necessary, in the same way that, you know, clinical medicine has been trying to move towards in many ways, yeah. Right? In overcoming the doctor as the patriarchal authority and moving towards something where it's more collaborative with patients or something. I think it's a really good point.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aline.
Hey, maybe I'll move to Ari now. Ari, feel free to show your video if you want, or chime in, and whether questioning whether policymakers truly want certainty. Do you want to expand on that a bit, Ari?
Sure, I'll try. It's a little bit crazy over here. If you hear some crying, it's not me. Might be me, but so Nick, thanks. Great talk. Yeah, I think I was really interested in this idea. Of course, for those of us interested in impact evaluation, this idea that ignorance is bliss for some policymakers has been around for some time. That there's not really an appetite for certain types of leaders for rigorous research evidence because it limits their policy options. So I think there's certain types of leaders like that. You've mentioned several of them, the Trumps and Bolsonaros of the world, who clearly don't want to have their autonomy, their kind of policy autonomy limited by research evidence. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that. Kind of, you said that there's that policymakers in general want certainty, but I think in many cases it seems like actually they don't want certainty or evidence of any sort. So that was one comment, and actually if I could add one more, I was wondering what your thoughts are on the observation that the costs have really accrued to certain population subgroups with respect to COVID that are disempowered in many ways. And I wonder if that's affected this mismatch between the kind of policy action we've seen versus what the evidence says. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Ari. Two great points. So the first, do leaders actually want evidence at all? I think it's a really good point. I think obviously there's a real spectrum of leaders. For me, I think I can't see into the brains of what leaders think or actually want. All I can do is look at what they do. And the thing that has really struck me, and it's again why I focus on weaponization, you know, the policymaking arena has always been and always will be essentially experimental, where we make decisions, we implement policies, we have no way of predicting what will happen, we see what happens, and then we hold the people who have made those decisions accountable or not for what they've done. And I think what weaponizing uncertainty really does is it's part and parcel of ensuring that people who make decisions are not held accountable for or can deflect accountability for those decisions. Again, I sort of am of two minds about this. If we have a democratic politics and information ecosystem that says we have people who have certainty, decisions taken by leaders on the advice of these certain experts are taken, and then they turn out wrong, or they turn out to have been mistakes, then what this allows is for decision makers to deflect accountability from their decision making onto the expert advisors. If instead we have an arena where expert advisors say, look, there are a variety of options, here are the possible range of outcomes, and then decision makers say, okay, here's what we're going to do, but they will be held accountable, again, not for the certainty, but for the process. And I think what we really need is not to try to find or identify the specific oases of certainty in a sea of uncertainty, but to have faith in a process that does the best job possible in trying to deal with and recognize this uncertainty. The second thing about the subgroups who are disempowered, I couldn't agree more. I've said more in a lot of other arenas about the social determinants of health and the sort of injustices about COVID-19. But one thing I didn't touch on that I really should have is that not just is there epistemic trespassing, there's epistemic injustice going on, where part of this selective amplification is that only certain voices, some voices of certainty are amplified and listened to, and people who are disenfranchised and powerless, their attempts to play a role in public debate are continuously suppressed. So I think that's absolutely part and parcel of what's going on. I'm happy to look at some of these questions in chat. I know we're running out of time and sort of try to go through them really quickly.
That would be helpful. There's a bunch of really good ones there.
Yeah, so I see Jay, I think you're absolutely right, which is that, you know, every grant application is in a sense scientists trying to promulgate false certainty. A lot of academia, the academic enterprise, runs on a lot of the things that I have been saying. And I think we really need to look to ourselves first, right? We have a lot of our institutional design, whether we like it or not, actually feeds into this idea that the people who pronounce certainty the most, they get the grant funding. They are, you know, it's not, this is why I think it's not anti-science versus science. I think we need to look at ourselves in that respect. And I think there are a lot of institutional redesigns that can help with that. So I think that's a really, really good point.
Yeah, the last scientist who ever got famous for being uncertain was Heisenberg. After that, he only got the money by being certain.
Yeah, maybe the only one, right? Yeah. I'm just running these down. I apologize if I skip over anyone. Policing social media, you know, Twitter putting disclaimers on false claims. I do think that is a step in the right direction, but I'm really cautious about delegating to large social media platforms the policing of truth. Again, I don't think we should be outsourcing to social media platforms whose business model is based on clicks and views, not on truth, the policing of truth. Again, I think that we need a more fundamental institutional redesign. Raphael talking about the parallels with tobacco companies. Your suggestion to shift our need for certainty, judicial skepticism, where does the political fit? How can we reconfigure our political sphere to avoid weaponization of XYZ? Well, there, unfortunately, Raphael, I just have to punt. I don't know exactly and I have 2 minutes. I have a lot of thoughts, but I think we kind of need to look to the political theorists and political scientists for how to redesign the political sphere to make more room for accountability and uncertainty. I'll finally settle on Jürgen on epistemic trespassing. It seems both intuitively appealing but problematic when we have uncertainty, radical disagreement, but also an inherently complex problem that eschews clear boundaries such as COVID-19. Is it something we should worry about, or could some measure of deliberate constructive trespassing be part of the solution? I think epistemic trespassing is a red herring. Epistemic trespassing only works if we have selective amplification. Epistemic trespassing only works if someone like Richard Epstein has the bully pulpit to get his views on something he doesn't know much about published, right? So again, while I do think epistemic trespassing in the short term is a problem, you know, there's an epidemiologist at Harvard who's sort of has the biggest Twitter following about COVID-19, and he's like a nutritional epidemiologist. He's clearly trespassing, but we shouldn't say, well, people shouldn't trespass, they should stay in their lane. I think telling people not to trespass and stay out of their lane is too powerful an argument to suppress minority voices in the way that Ari has often said. I think the problem is this selective amplification. And again, I don't know how to do it, but it's the fact that we don't actually have a true marketplace of ideas out there. I don't know if you have a response, Jürgen.
Well, we may have to take the response offline because we've reached the end of our allotted time. Thank you very much, Nick. You've given us, I'm quite certain that you've given us a lot to think about as we navigate our way through this crisis and others that are sure to come, where science will be a major actor. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of the people who attended. I'd just like to say that we have one more of these webinars happening a week from today, exactly the same time, on June 30th. Jonas Beaudry from the IHSP will be hosting a discussion on COVID-19 and the perils of quote-unquote warehousing people with disabilities. The more detailed information is available on the IHSP website, so we hope to find, I hope that a lot of you will attend. Thank you to Anaïk Fortier and to Jen Proudfoot for organizing the webinar. Thanks again to Nick, and hopefully see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for all the great comments and questions, and thanks again for attending.